Hey everybody, it's Steven GetMoneyMyrick here, and I have a very special video for all of you. I'm doing my updated Throne of Eldraine limited draft guide. I released a video before the format came out with a few of my thoughts to get people ready for the pre-release, but now that I've really got my hands on the format, got to draft it, probably dropped about 15 to 20 times now, mix of paper, arena, and MTGO. I've got a lot more experience in the format and have a lot more things I can share with you. So this video is meant to be a resource for anybody that doesn't know the format. Maybe you're jumping in, maybe you want to increase your knowledge. I'm going to be going over all 15 viable decks that we know about right now in this format. It's possible that by the end of the format, a few things might change. But right now, this is really meant to be an end-all, be-all, all the information you would ever want to know about drafting this format. So with that, let's get right in. Okay, the very first thing I want to talk about are the hybrid uncommons that are present in this format. They are very powerful cards, and they look like they're mana restricted because of the need for 4 colors. But the way that this format works is that monocolored decks are also viable, which is pretty unique for a limited format. And so when I said there's 15 viable deck strategies, that include the monocolored strategies. So Arcanist Owl here can be played in mono blue, mono white, or in blue white. So really, in 1/5 of the decks you'll be drafting, Arcanist Owl will be available. All these cards are powerful. I would say Occam Ranger is the weakest, the green-white one. I'm not super interested in playing that card. But cards like Arcanist Owl, Covetous Urge, Deathless Knight, Fireborn Knight, they all fit really well into and synergize really well with the strategies of the decks and what they want to do. You know, Rampart Smasher here is just a 4-mana 5/5 that Knights can't block it, and Knights are a big theme in this format. We'll go into a few of those decks. Resolute Rider is just very hard to deal with. Deathless Knight is in the black-green food deck that exists, you know, and you can sacrifice food, keep getting life, keeps coming back. Covetous Urge looks like a card that has traditionally been pretty bad because it's essentially like a duress. But when you consider the fact that it lets you take their best card out of their hand or their graveyard and then cast it later, it's very powerful. And Arcanist Owl is great because it's just a 4-mana 3/3 flyer that also can help you find some cards. So I wanted to talk by saying that these cards are a lot better than they look. They're a lot easier to cast than they look, and I'll be taking them pretty highly in most of my drafts. So since monocolored is a deck in this format, one of the most important things you can be doing is taking artifacts early. When you take artifacts, that gives you the ability to delay your decision about which deck you're going to be fitting into, and there are a few artifacts that you should always be looking out for. Lucky Clover I have in here. This one is actually more specifically towards the green-white Adventures deck, but it's a very, very powerful card, so I always take it early, and again, it helps you delay that decisions. There are adventure cards in other colors, so you could still be seeing play there, but I'll always take it early because it's an artifact, right? And so you don't have to commit to your colors. Same thing with Clockwork Servant. 3-mana 2/3 is, you know, not the best card, but if you're able to add a mana and draw another card, there's a lot of decks that want to do that, especially monocolored decks. Golden Egg is great because it fits into a bunch of different strategies and it helps fix your mana. Sorcerer's Broom at worst is a 2-mana 2/1, and at best is just an overwhelming in-game force that you can't defeat. So, you know, artifacts are very important. I've got a few weaker ones down here that I'll always take. Not always, but I'm just saying they help you delay that decision to figure out what color you're going to end. You get to see more cards, get to see what's being passed to you. Scalding Cauldron is a removal spell, 1 mana, and then you can pay 3 and sack it to deal 3. What's really nice is, you know, it splits up the cost because usually you don't have much you want to be doing on turn 1. So you can play this out, and then on turn, it's almost like a 3-mana deal 3 because usually you don't have 1 mana plays. Jousting Dummy is a 2-mana 2/1. And in a lot of other formats, having that 1 toughness can really hurt you. In Throne of Eldraine, having 1 toughness, there's really not too many cards that will blow you out and punish you. So this is almost a 2-mana 2/2 that you can also pump to give extra attack, and also will fit in any deck you want. I have almost always played every Jousting Dummy I've ever drafted just because it's a 2-mana 2/2, it slots in nicely, and it's just super flexible on your mana base. And finally, Gingerbread is a card I see a lot. It goes on a lot of different strategies. It can be very aggressive with its haste ability and unblockability. You can put some enchantments and auras on it. It can be a food that can gain you life against aggro decks. It can be a blocker. Goes into the black-green food deck. So I would definitely, you know, these 7 cards here specifically, and then some of these other ones down here, you know, I would always be looking to pick up artifacts to keep my colors open. Okay, before we go into any of the decks specifically, I want to talk about the removal in the format and the removal that you should be looking out for. It kind of goes without saying as I get into the other decks that all this removal you're going to want to play anyway. So when I'm talking about, you know, the red deck, all of these red removal spells I'm talking about are actually insane. And you can see there's 4 red removal spells. I ranked them, well, I didn't rank them really, because Red Cap Melee is probably the best, but Slaying Fire is amazing, Scorching Dragonfire is amazing, and then Searing Barrage is probably the weakest. But at the end of the day, red has a ton of great removal in this format, and you need to be keeping your eye out for it. Searing Barrage, the Adamant is pretty easy to trigger. Adamant is something that is a mechanic in this format that when you spend 3 mana of the same color, in this case red mana, it'll have an additional effect. So in this case, it does 3 damage to the controller. And I actually just lost a draft yesterday by the guy able to trigger that 3 mana to my face. I was at 2 life and couldn't kill him. Black does not have as many, right? I mean, there's 4 removal spells in red, but black has another set of amazing removal in this format. And that's what you're going to see is the removal in this format is great. And that makes for some very, very good gameplay. Bacon to Pie is extremely good. Just a 4 mana removal spell. Epic Downfall is at uncommon, so you're not going to see as often, but Epic Downfall is amazing. And Reef Soul is also very, very good. You know, there's just a lot of great removal in red and black. White, again, we're just saying more great removal. Outflank is the weakest here because it requires that you have a board presence in order to be useful, but in the decks that are playing it, it can be a very powerful way to push through damage when they go up to block, and you can just kill their blocker and still feel free to attack. Trapped in Tower is great. Glass Cascade is great. There's a lot of enchantment-based removal and artifact-based removal, and we're going to talk about... Glass Cascade is better because it can't be bounced. The creature can't be bounced. But Trapped in Tower, and then along with Blue's removal spell, and maybe I should put Blue first. Right, all of their removal spell is enchantment-based. And there is a bounce spell in this format that will allow you to return your creature to hand. So keep that in mind if you're playing, and it's in blue. It's called Runaway Together. It's a 1 and a blue. And so keep that in mind if you're trying to remove a creature and you're up against a blue deck. They may have a way to interact it. Obviously, you can destroy it as well. There's a few destroy artifact and enchantment spells in this set. But for the most part, Trapped in Tower has been great. It does fall off if you're able to give a creature flying, and there is a pump spell in this set that gives creatures flying in white, so you want to look out for that as well. We'll talk about that spell later. Green has 1 good removal spell, and it's actually a great removal spell in Outmuscle. You put a counter on a creature and that fights a creature, and then if you can pay the adamant cost, it gains indestructible. Anytime you can, you should be trying to get these adamant costs going. Specifically, if they have some combat trick where they can pump their creature and you go to fight it, it's going to feel really bad if your creature dies or if they trade. But if you're able to adamant it, then you know, okay, well, it's indestructible. No matter what they do, I'm going to be fine. The other thing is when you're playing against a green deck in this format, you know that this is, if they're mono green, this is their only removal spell, really. They have combat tricks and pump spells and auras, but when it comes to actual removal, it's Outmuscle and it's 3 and a green. So, you know, keep that in mind when you're playing against green decks. Finally, in colorless, we talked about already a little bit, Scalding Cauldron. You always want to play 1 or 2 of these in your decks. It's just super flexible. It helps delay your decision what color you're going to be in. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about are combat tricks. So these are the combat tricks you should be looking out for, and I've listed them by what you're most likely to see. The last 2 here, Bargain and Lash of Thorns, which we'll break down real quick. You know, these cards don't see nearly as much play. Rimrock Knight is a great card. You're going to see this anytime you're playing up against a red deck, and you should prepare that at any point they can pay 1 red and give a creature +2/+0. The nice thing is it doesn't bump toughness, so you know if you're playing mono red that their creature's going to at least die unless they can like shock your blocker or kill your blocker before damage. But it makes it very scary to know that they can pump a creature with 2 more attack. Silver Flame Squire, you know, we talked about how Jousting Dummy is an okay as a 2 mana 2/1. Silver Flame Squire is the same. It has a weird adventure mechanic. that target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn and untap it. It's weird because it costs more than the creature itself. So you kind of want to hold these back as a combat trick, but you also want to be playing this on turn 2. So it does have some weird flow like that, but the ability to untap your creature is pretty relevant. And if you're playing against white in an aggressive deck, I would plan on seeing this combat trick 2 and a white for +2/+2. Garenbray Carver is a card that I was not high on when the set came out because it's a 4-mana 3/2. But that Shield's Might, the adventure portion of it, giving them +2/+2, has been very relevant a lot of times. Because like I mentioned, green does not have removal, but it does have what combat tricks and does have a way to push through damage. And Garenbray Carver is one of those. And these are all 3 cards that you'll see. So Tiny you'll also see. It's an enchantment that gives a creature -2/-0 and it has flash. So I put it under combat tricks. I also put it under removal. But, it's pseudo removal. But if they're able to reduce your attack net, and then they can set up a good block for them, that's sort of removal. Bargain and Lash of Thorns. If you're playing a aggressive red deck, I've seen Bargain get played. I've never seen a good use for Lash of Thorns. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm more willing to put this in the video just to make you aware that it's out there. And finally, before we get into the specific decks, I want to talk about counter spells and the ones you're most likely to see. You'll see there's 2 at uncommon. And only 1 at common. So 1 blue and a blue counter target spell. So if you're playing against a blue deck and they have 1 blue up, you need to be aware that they'll have this card. If they're going for a mono blue strategy, they're much more likely to have it because the mono blue deck is trying to mill people typically. Hypnotic Sprite is just a great card, 2-mana 2/1 flyer, but you can also have this ability to counter a target spell with mana 3 or less. So if they only have 2 and a blue, that you can play around it if you play something that's higher than 3 convert mana cost. And then Drown Lock is an awesome card. It's a removal spell and a counter spell, but it's only available in blue and black. So, you're not going to run against it too often, but it is a giant pool. If somebody is playing blue and black, I would expect them to have at least 1 copy of this card in their deck because it is a large pool into that color pair. So this is a list that I took from Limited Level Ups. It's a Court of Calls, and here's a link to it. I'll have a link in the description. And I thought it was just a really good way of, if you're starting the draft, of knowing which card you should take, pick one, pack one, specifically looking at uncommons. So this first list here are cards that you should take over the best common in the set, which is Bake Into a Pie. And Bake Into a Pie is that black removal spell, 2 black, destroy target creature, create a food token. And these are ranked in order of what he would take. So you can go to that link if you're starting a draft and you don't know where to start and is this uncommon good? This is a good list of what to look for in that first pick one, pack one. The other list here is pick one, pack one over the second best commons. So the second best commons are Scorching Dragonfire, which is a red removal spell, Reef Soul, which is a black removal spell, and Ardenvale Tactician, which is a white flying adventure creature that we'll talk a lot about in this video. These are cards that he would take over those. So it would go these cards, Bake Into a Pie, these cards, and then Reef Soul, Ardenvale Tactician, Scorching Dragonfire. Okay? So I'll have a link to that video, to that article in the video description. I think it's just super helpful if you're drafting to just say, okay, here's where the powerful uncommons are that I should actually consider taking over the most powerful commons. So as I mentioned, we're going to be going over all 15 decks, and we're going to start with the monocolored decks first. And I'm going to talk about some of the cards that really pull me into mono white. So Archon of Absolute, and some of these will be rare, some of these will be uncommons. You know, it's basically the cards I expect to see in a deck if I'm going up against it. So Archon of Absolution is just a house. It feels like a mythic card with the fact that it has pro-white, so it can be hard to deal with. It can block a lot of flyers, and they have to pay 1. Sir Alan the Lion's Claw, just giving everything when they attack first strike, just makes for some very, very awkward combat math. Fireborn Knight is, you know, really a 4-mana 4/3 at the minimum, and then you can also pump and go crazy. So those are the things that are sort of pulling me into mono white. Like if I see these cards, okay, I'm kind of interested in going mono white, or at least definitely playing white. Then we have the commons. The best common in white is Ardenvale Tactician, and for 1 white, a 2/3 flyer, that's great. But also this Dizzying Swoop, 1 and a white to tap up to 2 target creatures. It's just crazy when you're doing an aggressive strategy how helpful that can be to push in that last few points of damage. This card is just amazing. I love it. Along with that, Fairy Guide Mother. Sure, it's a 1 mana 1/1 flyer. Excuse me. And that's not, the best. It'll usually get a few points of damage in. But this Gift of the Fae, giving a creature flying and +2/+1, when you're trying to close out a deck and do the last few points of damage, like, just feels amazing to put this on a 4/4 and just swing in for 6, and like they have no blockers for it. Like, you can just really do some damage out of nowhere. And then go along with that Flutter Fox. This is a 2/2. It doesn't have flying. You need an artifact or enchantment, but there are a lot of artifacts that can trigger Flutter Fox to give it flying. And again, that just feels great to be aggressive like that. The Jousting Dummy we talked about is an artifact that can trigger it. The Clockwork Servant, if you're a mono white, you get a 3 mana 2/3 draw a card. Like, that feels great. Trapped in the Tower will trigger it because it's an enchantment. And you're not dying on any crackbacks. You free up your blockers. These 3 commons here really, really pull me into white, especially Ardenvale Tactician. They don't pull me into white. Once I'm in white, it's like, okay, how many of these can I get? I would love a deck with just Fairy Godmothers, Ardenvale Tacticians, Flutter Foxes. One card I want to talk about mono white is Silverflame Ritual. This is a card that looks pretty bad. 3 white, put a +1/+1 counter each creature you control. And if you pay the Adamant, which would be 3 white, then your creatures gain Vigilance. This card is actually pretty good. I'd be happy to play 1 in a deck. And it's a card that I wasn't playing early on in the format, but since then it's a big game when you can get all of your Fairy Guide Mothers out, and now they're 2/2s. We'll talk more about Mysterious Path later. Obviously, it's good with adventures, and there's some good white adventure cards we were talking about. This is an example deck of a mono white deck, and you'll notice I say mono white. You can actually see they have 4 red sources, and that's something that's really common in Eldraine, is to be nearly mono of a color, but then play 3 or 4 colors of another source to splash like 1 spell. So you can see here what they're really, really splashing white for is Ember Shieldbreaker, which is great at taking out artifacts and enchantments, and Sundering Stroke, which is just a great card for closing out games. And this right here, you can see what I was talking about with the hybrid cards being playable. It's like Resolute Rider seems like it's a restricted mana cost, but in reality, you can play this in a mono white deck. This deck has Flutter Foxes as a Fairy Guide Mother. It's got the Ardenvale Tactician. It's got the Archon of Absolution. So this is just an example of a what I call mono white. Obviously, it's a splash of red, but it's near mono white. Okay, the next deck I want to talk about is the mono blue deck. This deck has gained some notoriety in Magic: The Gathering Arena, specifically because it can be very good at milling out opponents, and the bots are not targeting a specific card, Merfolk Secret Keeper, very highly. This card, mill, is actually a thing in Throne of Eldraine. It's not just like a joke, and it's very real, because with Merfolk Secret Keeper's Adventure, where they put 4 in their graveyard and run away together, the ability to return a creature to your hand, you can just keep playing this adventure and milling them a lot. We mentioned Didn't Say Please in the counter spell section. That puts 3 cards in the graveyard. I can't believe I don't have So Tiny in here. But So Tiny, that enchantment we talked about, it'll give a creature -6/-0 if they have at least 7 cards in their graveyard. So the mill deck is very real in blue. Cards that will really pull you in, obviously Gadwick the Wizened is insane in mono blue, and you can see with that 3 blue and its cost, it's pretty much only playable in mono blue or near mono blue. But if you can pay this for like 7 or 6 and get a 3/3 that draws you 3 cards, and then also whenever you play a blue spell, it taps down their creatures so they can't attack. It's just crazy. Folio Fancies is just the quickest way to mill somebody out. Very strong. Arcanist Owl will help you find your enchantments like Charm Sleep, your artifacts like Witching Well. Witching Well is great because it'll help you even out your draws. Clockwork Servant we talked about. Vantress Paladin is just a 4-mana 3/3 flyer in mono blue. And one card that's very powerful in mono blue is Turn, and it's not just mono blue, but the fact that it has an adamant makes it better home, is Turn to a Pumpkin. Just bouncing their card to their hand, drawing a card, and creating a food token is just a great tempo play. Here's an example of what a mono blue deck will look like, and again you can see that somebody's splashing red here, and they're splashing red specifically for Improbable Alliance, which is a great card, a great thing to splash for, because whenever you draw a card you get a 1/1 fairy. You can see all the Secret Keepers, you can see all the Runaway Togethers, you can see the Didn't Say Pleases. The goal is just to mill them out, and in this case create a lot of 1/1s. The next deck I want to talk about is mono black. And when you're talking about pulls into mono black, I would say Bacon to a Pie is the biggest pull at common. I would say Sir Conrad and Revenge of Ravens and Epic Downfall are giant pulls at uncommon. Black is just very deep in this set, and I've actually have not gotten to draft a ton because a lot of people want to be in it because of its great removal. We talked about Epic Downfall, we talked about Reef Soul, we talked about Bacon to a Pie. Okay, Sir Conrad out uncommon is very, very strong. Clackbridge Troll at rare is extremely strong because you either get an 8/8 Trampler Haste and they either take it or you draw cards and gain life. It's just very, very powerful in draft. Revenge of Ravens shuts down a lot of aggressive decks. We talked about the 1/1 flying fairies. Like, you cannot attack into a creature with 1/1 creatures. You cannot attack into a player with 1/1 creatures when Revenge of Ravens is on the battlefield. This card looks like a do-nothing card. It's actually insane. It's a very, very strong pull into black. Deathless Knight, we talked about the ability to get some food token and play it. Foulmire Knight is another uncommon. Just the ability to draw a card on an adventure, but also get a 1/1 Death Touch is a great blocker. Reaper Knight is a card that traditionally doesn't look great, but actually does a lot of work. Specifically, it's just a nice card to pay 4 mana, have them discard 2 cards, and then later in the game you can pay 7 and get a 4/5 that usually will have flying by the point it attacks. That's essentially a 3-for-1. Foreboding Fruit is the card draw spell in black. It also creates food tokens, which can trigger your Deathless Knights to come back from the graveyard. Order of Midnight is another uncommon, and you'll notice a lot of the stuff I've talked about so far have been uncommons. Black has a lot of great uncommons, and then some good removal in Reef Soul and Bacon to a Pie. Order of Midnight will return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, so you can return your Sir Conrad, you can return your Clackbridge Troll. Black has a lot of good cards. Here's an example of a mono black deck. And this is actually, in my mind, a relatively weaker deck, but it shows some of the ability of playing those hybrid cards that we talked about. They're playing 3 different hybrid cards in this deck because of the fact that they are just essentially mono black, right? Lost Legion I didn't have up here. It's a 2/3 that lets you scry 2. That's good. Foreboding Fruit to draw cards. Malevolent Noble I also don't have here. It's a 2/2, but you can sacrifice a creature or enchantment to give it a +1/+1 counter. Next, we're going to talk about mono red. The biggest pulls into mono red in my mind are Torbrand. He is just insane, and obviously with his 3 red pips, he's pretty mana intensive on mono red. But he's a big pull into it. Circara the Bold at uncommon is a large pull into red, as well as Opportunistic Dragon at rare is a large pull into red. As I mentioned, and I guess really Sundering Stroke, if you're able to cast this for 7 and in mono red, you're dealing 7 damage to 3 different permanents or players. Like, you can kill any 2 of their creatures and deal 7 to them is just usually, obviously, game over. The removal in red is great, like we talked about at the top of the video. And then at your common level, Rimrock Knight is a house. I love Rimrock Knight. I would just play a ton of these. Like I mentioned, the 1 toughness doesn't get punished nearly as much in this format. Rampart Smasher, just a 5 mana or 4 mana 5/5. You're really looking, if you're playing red, I'm expecting them to have a Torbrand. I'm expecting them to have a rare card that is pulling them into mono red. actually lost to mono red last night. A very aggressive deck. Here's an example here. I realize I call it mono red, and again, they're splashing a few green spells for Grumgully. Grumgully is great because he'll pump all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters. They've got 7 Dwarves here, which is a card that when you play an additional copy, they give each other +1/+1. So it's a 2/2, but if you play another one, then they both become 3/3s. Okay, the final monocolored deck we're going to talk about is green. Feasting Troll King is a big reason to go mono green. A 7/6 Vigilance Trampler that creates 3 food tokens, and you can sack 3 food tokens to bring it back from the graveyard. Very, very powerful. When I'm playing against mono green, I'm expecting to see a lot of, well, not a lot of. I'm expecting them to have a Feasting Troll King. I'm expecting them to have a Garenbrig Paladin, which is a 5-mana 4/4, but with its adamant, it becomes a 5/5, and it can't be blocked with creatures with power 2 or less. Like, that's a pretty strong reason to play Garenbrig Paladin. A 5-mana 5/5 that almost has unblockable in some board states in this format is pretty strong. Common, Fierce Witchstalker is the best green common in my opinion, along with Outmuscle, a 4-mana 4/4 that creates a food. Outmuscle we talked about in our removal section. One powerful card you'll want to be taking early if you can is Trail of Crumbs. Anytime you sack a food, you can pay 1, and then you can look at the top 2 cards of your library and reveal a permanent card, so that can include lands, and put them into your hand. So it's a good way to get like a draw engine. Curious Pair looks like a do-nothing card. The fact that you can't create that food token, and then it's a good blocker later, can be pretty relevant. Keeper of Fables, if you have a way to make a creature unblockable or flying, or clear the board with an Outmuscle and then draw more cards, just very powerful. But if I'm playing against mono green, I'm expecting them to have some Fierce Witchstalkers, some Paladins, some Outmuscles, so they can do their adamant, and maybe a Feasting Troll King at rare. Here's an example of a mono green deck. Again, they're splashing black, so but it's mostly mono green. This one's pretty aggressive. Like I said, they've got the Garenbrig Paladins, they got the Feasting Troll King, they got Fierce Witchstalker, they've got rare at Wicked Wolf, just the Deathless Knight. The reasons to play mono green would be Feasting Troll King and Garenbrig Paladin. Okay, so we are done with the monocolored decks, and now I'm going to talk about the dual colored decks, and we're going to start by talking with Izzet. Izzet involves drawing your second card each turn, and there are some ways to do that, and there's some payoffs for doing that. So we're going to start with the payoffs. Improbable Alliance is a 2-mana enchantment that whenever you draw your second card each turn, you get a 1/1 fairy. And later in the game, it's its own engine as well. So it's not just a payoff, but it's also an enabler. Fairy Vandal, a 1/2 flyer that you can put a counter on when you draw your second card. Mad Ratter, creating 2 1/1 black rat creatures whenever you draw a second card. Great. Sage of the Fells is, I guess, really an enabler, not a payoff. But whenever it enters the battlefield or a non-human creature enters the battlefield, you can draw a card and discard a card. So the action of drawing and then discarding is drawing a second card each turn. So that's going to trigger your Improbable Alliances, your Fairy Vandals, and Mad Ratters. And if you're going against an Izzet deck, sorry, my mouse is going crazy. If you're going against an Izzet deck, I expect them to have the Mad Ratters and the Improbable Alliances. Turn to a Pumpkin will draw you a card. Tome Raider will draw you a card. Golden Egg will draw you a card. Merchant of the Veil is one of the most common ways you'll see this triggered, the Adventure specifically. So that's sort of the play you have to look at in early game, is if they play their Bloodhaze Wolverine as a 2/1, and then on turn 3, if you're attacking to them or they're attacking to you, and they have 1 red open at least, they can make that a 3/2 first striker. The other way they'll enable it at instant speed is throw a possibility. So they'll discard a card and then draw 2 cards. Unexplained Vision is good in the late game for drawing cards. Witching Well will smooth out your draw steps at the beginning because you get the scry 2, and then later you'll draw 2 and trigger Improbable Alliance and Fairy Vandal. One thing to know about this deck is it can be hard to get into because a lot of people like to play this deck. The other thing to know about it is if you are going against a deck that has Revenge of Ravens, it is extremely, extremely difficult for you to win because all the things you're making are 1/1 rats or 1/1 fairies, And if you're attacking into a Revenge of Ravens, which is that black enchantment that whenever you attack that player, they'll gain life for each creature you're attacking them with, and you'll lose life for each creature you're attacking with. So if you attack with 10 1/1s, they gain 10 life, you lose 10 life, and then they take 10 damage. So they essentially took no damage, and you lost 10 life. So just something to keep in mind. It wouldn't necessarily pull me off of doing it, but if you're going up against a mono black deck or a black deck, you need to watch out for the Revenge of Ravens and have a plan. Maybe, turning it into a pumpkin on how you're going to deal with that Revenge of Ravens. Golden Egg is, like I said, just a strong card for drawing and triggering some of your stuff. So here's a sample deck. It has the, I should have put this in here, the Lock Dragon is a way to trigger your drawing. Thrill of Possibility, Scorching Dragonfire, you're getting that good red that we talked about, Searing Barrage, Red Cat Melee. Gadwick is in this deck, which I don't even know if I necessarily agree with this, because I feel like this is going to be staying in your hand until very late game. But, turn 7, which is maybe when you want to be casting anyway. So, yeah, this deck actually looks pretty insane. The next deck we're going to talk about is Boros. So, Boros is an aggressive deck in this format, and what it really relies upon are the 3 white creatures we talked about in the mono white deck: Flutterfox, Ardenvale Tactician, and Fairy Godmother. These 3 creatures, I love them all together, and then when you're able to Rimrock Knight, your Ardenvale Tactician and give them 4 flying, or your Flutterfox has flying because it's an enchantment and now you can swing for 4 flying, or you're able to give your Rimrock Knight flying with Fairy Godmother, so now you're swinging for 5 damage flying. They're just a great combination. One of the pulls will be Inspiring Veteran, which will give your knights +1/+1. So Ardenvale Tactician and Rimrock Knight are obviously both knights. Brimstone Trebuchet is sort of an inevitability engine where it'll just keep pinging you down. Outflank is strong in this deck because of the amount of creatures that you have. And then some of the pulls into it would be Fireborn Knight, Cerkera, some of the stuff we were talking about in the mono white and the mono red decks. I did want to talk about Joust here. Joust is not a card that I would usually recommend playing, and I definitely wouldn't recommend playing it in red and white. You can if you're really short on removal, but the awkward part about Joust is that it does not pump your toughness much, and a lot of the knights have very low toughness. And so if you're giving your knight +1 toughness, that might not be enough for it to survive a trade with the bigger creature you're trying to clear the way out of. So just something to keep in mind with Joust, because it looks like a very strong card if you're in a red-white knight deck, but I'm not super high on Joust. Here's an example of a red-white deck, and this one is not nearly as aggressive. You can see you have the Ardenvale Tactician, you have a Flutterfox, you have a Fairy Godmother, and then what you really have are these 4 Fireborn Knights, so that's just a lot of first strike damage coming at you. The ability to give one of those flying and then pump it. Whew. For white-black, what you're getting access to really is some of the great removal that black has to offer, and you're getting Order of Midnight. You're still looking into the Ardenvale Tacticians and Fairy Godmothers. Wintermoor Commander is not the best card. If I'm in a white-black Knights deck, I'll play it. It looks like, if you're in white-black, you should play it. Not necessarily, and I don't see this card played too much. Resolute Rider, if you can get to an in-game, is very difficult to deal with. Foreboding Fruit for drawing cards. Smith Sword Master is at the minimum a 2/1 lifelinker. At the most, you can be draining them for a couple points of damage. Barrow Witches will bring a knight back to your hand, so the ability to bring back an Ardenvale Tactician that they were able to deal with can be pretty rough. And I want to talk about Forever Young here, because it's the first time it's come up. Forever Young is great because at the worst it just cycles itself. You just draw a card and you don't put any creatures on top. At its best, like I said, Mill is a very real deck in this format, and if you're able to put 10 creatures back from your graveyard on top of your library and they're all gas, right? Like if you're able to hold this against a Mill deck, that feels extremely, extremely powerful. So you would definitely want at least some. I would always play probably 1 Forever Young, If you're going against a mill strategy, I would play as many copies of this card as you can because you want to make sure it doesn't get milled away and that you can survive. Here's an example of a black-white deck. So we talked about the, I guess I didn't spend enough time really in white removal. You know, you get the Trapped in the Towered enchantments. You get the Ardenvale Tactician. You get the Resolute Riders. This one has a Bacon to a Pie. Like I said, when I'm going over these decks, I didn't have Bacon and Pie here. Bacon Pie is the best common in the set. Like, you want to be playing Bacon to a Pie. You want to be playing the removal in the set. I just didn't have enough space necessarily to talk about every card that I would expect to see in the format. And again, you can see that Barrel Witches to bring back Knights and stuff. You can bring back your Resolute Riders if they have a way to deal with it. Like, that's just very powerful. Okay, the next deck we're going to talk about is Black-Red. Black-Red has a Knight sub-theme, but specifically what Black-Red has is all the removal. And so I know in other decks I have not shown the removal in these sections here. I just want to really emphasize just how freaking great the removal in Black-Red is. You get Revenge of Ravens down so they can't attack you. And maybe you get a Steel Claw Lance, which is a great enchantment if you have a few Knights to close out a game. But really, whenever I've played Black-Red, it's been a... like, I want all the best removal I can take. I want a Revenge of Ravens so you don't want to attack me. And then just slowly in-game, I'll have some, Reaper of Night that, I didn't put it in here, but Reaper of Night, the card that becomes it's 7 mana for a 4/5 that usually has Adventure. And it's it's a 7 mana for 4/5 that usually has Flying. And has the Adventure 3 and a black to make them discard 2. An example of a black-red deck here. This one is a much more aggressive red deck than what I was describing, and that obviously works as well. The Order of Midnight here is great. It's just a 2-mana, 2/2 flyer that's coming in. With Steel Claw Lance, now it's a 4/4 flyer. That just becomes very difficult to deal with. They have the Sir Conrad the Grim, which we talked about as being one of the strongest uncommons in the set. So this is, I put this one in here as an example of how you could go more aggressive with like a black-red Knight sub-theme, but you can also go late game with a lot of removal. Okay, the next deck we're going to talk about is Simic, the green-blue. I've not quite got my pulse on green-blue and what they're trying to do. There's a lot of good green cards, and there's a lot of good blue cards. There's not too many great, green-blue cards. Thunderous Snapper, I'm not in love with. It's hard to trigger because you usually don't want to put too many 5-mana creatures in your deck or 5-mana spells. Beanstalk Giant's good, Keeper of Fables good. Those are some of the 5s I'm looking for. Toonville Tree Folk is also above it. So sort of the goal with blue and green is to get color fixing and also to get ramping. You get the color fixing through Rosethorn Acolyte and also through blanking. Sorry, I gotta go all the way up here now, just because I feel so bad. And also with Golden Eggs. Oh, here it is. I didn't have to go all the way up. That's how you're getting your color fixing. So blue and green, you can usually splash, one other color. Maybe you splash a red to get the Improbable Alliance. Maybe you splash black to get an Epic Downfall or a Reef Soul in your deck. And then you just hope that by in-game with Toonville Tree Folk, Giant Beanstalk, especially Fierce Witch Stalker, you're able to close out the game. So it's sort of just a good cards deck, I would say. And here's an example of one of those decks. You can see they're splashing white here to get some ramp into some of the bigger creatures like Keeper of Fables. Moonlight Scavengers I didn't have here. I actually kind of like that card because if you have a Keeper of Fables, they'll allow you to bounce something back to their hand to free up an attack to then trigger your Keeper of Fables. Again, it's just sort of a good creature deck. Okay, the next deck we're going to talk about is Black-Green Food. Black-Green Food is a very powerful deck, but it's also a very slow deck. Most of the time, you're kind of playing for the late game. You're playing for the inevitability. You're playing to get all those food tokens that it's just hard for your opponent to ever do enough damage to quite kill you. Savvy Hunter is a giant pool into Black-Green. The amount of food tokens it can create is insane, as well as the giant payoff you get and being able to sacrifice 2 and draw a card. And if you think about it this way, we talked about Trail of Crumbs, which maybe I don't have on it. Yeah, Trail of Crumbs, you sack 2, and then you can pay 2, and look at, it's so many triggers. It's great. Foreboding Fruit for drawing cards. Fierce Witchstalker will create a food token when it comes in. Tempting Witch will create a food token when it comes in. Malevolent Noble can sack the food tokens to make it bigger. Curious Pair makes food tokens. Bognati sacks food tokens to kill creatures. Sorcerer's Broom and Witch's Oven is a pretty nice combo here. Whenever you sacrifice another permanent, so in this case a food, you can pay 3 to make a copy of the Sorcerer's Broom. Witch's Oven. Whenever you sack a creature, you can create a food token, so you can sack your brooms to create food, to create more brooms. There's just a lot of inevitability, and that's why I put Forever Young on here as well, is because that's another card that gives you that inevitability where you can just put all your gas back on top of your deck. So you can get to that late game. Have a Revenge of Ravens, have some of the great removal in black, have an Outmuscle. It's just a very powerful deck. Here's an example. You can see they got double Reaper of Night, which is really more like a 4-mana card. You got 2 Bacon to a Pie, some Epic Downfalls. This one's not as much on the food strategy, but you can still see it's got the Savvy Hunter and the Sorcerer's Broom, and that's just some incredibly powerful synergy. They're also playing Garenbrig Carver here, which is the combat trick we discussed from before. I'm not quite sure I agree with that, but maybe I do. Yeah, actually, I like that too. So they're playing Giant Skewer, which is a card that is only playable in black-green food, and even then it's not the best because it doesn't do much, but it does create food tokens, and if you can just create those food tokens and draw a bunch of cards with Savvy Hunter, you feel like you're doing it. The next deck we're going to talk about is Black Blue Dimir. Really looking to take advantage of milling your opponents with Merfolk Secret Keeper Runaway Together to get their graveyard really big so that your Drown the Lock does a ton of damage, so that your So Tiny gives them -6, and then closing out the game with Sir Conrad, right? I mean, just milling them and then dealing a ton of damage with Sir Conrad is great. Covetous Urge, taking their best card out of their hand. It's great. Revenge of Ravens, making it so it's awkward to attack you. Turn to a pumpkin, delays the game. These are the cards I'm looking to see if I'm playing against a blue-black deck. A card I'm not expecting to see, but is a giant pull into black-blue is Lochmere Serpent. Lochmere Serpent's one of the most powerful rares in the set, so just keep your eye out for that card as well. There's not much you can do about it if your opponent has it, honestly, but yeah, it's something you might come across. And then Reaper of Night here, just as a in-game finisher in case the mill plan doesn't go the way you want. I cannot stress just how interactive this, or how meaningful this interaction is between Merfolk Secret Keeper and Runaway Together. The ability to keep bouncing it back to your hand and having your opponent mill 4 with the adventure portion is just huge. Here's an example of a black-blue deck. Lots of Didn't Say Pleases, and lots of Permission, a Charm Sleep, Turn to a Pumpkin, the Sir Conrad. This one does have the Lochmere Serpent. I just pulled these deck pictures up, and that was actually the first result. And 2 So Tinies, so just some inevitability. This one is not making use of the Merfolk Secret Keeper, so they're not really trying to mill you quite as much with that strategy. It's more the Didn't Say Pleases and the Sir Conrads that'll get them there. Okay, Green-White is next. This is one of my favorite decks. The reason it's so powerful is because of Edgewall Innkeeper. This card, if you played with Risen Reef in M20, is pretty similar, where whenever you're playing a Adventure Spell, you draw a card. So Adventure Spells are already great, and you want them in your deck in limited formats because of the flexibility they provide. And the Edgewall Innkeeper is giving you even more value for playing those cards by getting to draw a card. Mysterious Pathlighter, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer I would play no matter what. But the fact that it also will give your adventure creatures +1/+1 is awesome. Again, we have Ardenvale Tactician, Fairy Guide Mother. My favorite thing to do, I cannot stress enough, is to Gift of the Fae my Fierce Witchstalker. And all of a sudden it's a 6/5 flyer on turn 5, and that is just a hell of a clock. Prize Griffin I wanted to make sure I talked about, because it's one of these cards that doesn't necessarily, it's not the best in any deck, so a lot of times I don't see it getting played. But it is just a very, very fine finisher in a lot of decks. A 3/4 flyer. There's really not too many cards that can deal with that. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time to just talk about Prize Griffin and say that you should consider playing it in your decks. Wandermere is the gold card for black and green. I don't find it as much of a payoff. Yeah, can it get there? Can it get big? Absolutely. Would you pay a 3-mana 3/3? Sure, but it's not a pull into green-white for me, unlike Mysterious Pathlighter and Edgewall Innkeeper are, or even Ardenvale Tactician in white. Here's an example of a green-white deck. You can see they got the Flutter Foxes for aggro. They got some removal and Trapped in Tower and Scalding Cauldron. They only have one copy of Edgewall Innkeeper, which is pretty typical of what you run across. They do have the Lovestruck Beast, which is, pretty insane, and a Mysterious Pathlighter. So they're going to draw a card and get a 6/6 when they have the Mysterious Pathlighter out, and they have double Ardenvale Tactician. So this is a deck I like a lot. They're playing 2 Rosethorn Halberds. I don't think that's correct. I would never play more than one of those. That's an artifact, and specifically the equip cost is just so high. It's free when you cast it, but if you ever lose that creature, it's just so expensive to re-equip it. The next deck we're talking about is red-green, which is called Gruul. It's a powerful deck for sure. I like Fierce Witchstalker. I like Outmuscle. It's the same green cards we talked about. You get the great removal in red, like Scorching Dragonfire, Red Cap Melee. You get some aggressive beats in Rimrock Knight. Rimrock Knight is not a human, so it can trigger the Keeper of Fables. You get Garenberg Carver, which we've talked about a few times now. You get the Paladin. I did put Rosethorn Halberd in this because there is a sub-theme of non-humans in the Gruul deck. So you're likely to have, here's a dwarf, here's a dragon, here's a giant, here's a wolf. Not as many humans and not as many night humans as in some of the other colors. Grumgully is great. He's highly splashable, especially if you're like in that green-blue deck and you can splash to get some red. Obviously, if you're base red-green and you can get enough playables, he's great as well, but he's really more of a secret splash card in like a green-blue deck. Opportunistic Dragon is obviously extremely powerful, 4-mana 4/3 flyer that also can take one of their creatures. And we talked about Rampart Smasher just being a 4-mana 5/5 that can be hard to block. I have not gotten a chance to play Gruul, but I would be pulled into it if I had some strong removal and if I had some Fierce Witchstalkers and Keeper of Fables. That would really pull me into that direction. Here's an example of a deck. You can see they have the Opportunistic Dragon, they have the Grumgully, they have the Rampart Smasher. This particular deck has a great hinge, and all these deck pictures are 3/0 deck pictures, by the way. And then they have the Scorching Dragonfire removal as well. So, okay, we're getting pretty near the end here. Next up, we're talking about Azorius or blue-white. This deck is really looking to flood the board with a lot of artifacts and enchantments. You're seeing a lot of the same things on the So Tinies, the Trapped in Towers. These are all Golden Egg. These are all artifacts and enchantments that are going to pump your Shine Chaser to make it a 3/3 Flying Vigilance. Turn to a pumpkin, can create an artifact and the food token to trigger your Flutter Fox, so it has flying. Moonlight Scavengers is best in this deck because there's just a lot of artifacts and enchantments in this format, and you don't have to try too hard to get them out there, and this deck really, really uses them to the best of its ability. Animating Fairy is best in this deck because it can take something like your Golden Egg and make it a 4/4, which is nuts. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about all the glitters. Again, it's another card that's probably best in this deck, but because of just how big it can make your creature. But I also want to talk about it when you equip onto a Ginger Brute, which is that 1/1 haster that you can make it unblockable except for creatures that have haste can block it. If you can put all the glitters on there already, that is a 3/3 unblockable. If you have a few other artifacts or enchantments out on the field, that becomes 5 unblockable damage. So enchantments aren't the great, or specifically because if they're removed, you get the creature removed as well. But a lot of people don't want to pay a premium removal spell to take care of a 1-mana 1/1. So I just want to talk about that card a little bit and all the glitters. I've played this deck probably the most out of any other deck in the format. I like playing it a lot. I play it mostly because white is open and because people actually aren't super high on blue in this format because its removal isn't the best. It's more enchantment-based removal. And I just really enjoy all the triggers, all the card draws, all the flying. Just a great deck. Here's an example of a black-white deck that 3-0'd. You can see you got the Trapped in Towers. You can see you got the Arcanist Owl. Did I have Arcanist Owl in here? Wow. We need to go all the way back up to the top. Give me 1 second here. Arcanist Owl. I'm sorry that I didn't include this in the deck. Arcanist Owl is the biggest pull into this deck because you're the most likely to find a target off of its Enter the Battlefield trigger ability. So you would love paying 4 mana for a 3/3 flyer. The fact that it can draw you a card a lot of the times and even potentially give you options between 2 cards. It's just extremely powerful. So apologies for not having that card included here, but that's actually the biggest pull into this deck. So back to this 3-0 deck list, you can see they got 2 Arcanist Owls. The Weapon Rack is a terrible pick. Don't ever play Weapon Rack, but they have Glass Casket removal. They got Trap Tower, which is removal. They got the Witching Well to even out their draws. So yeah, that's a 3-0 deck. One other thing I want to talk about before we finish the video is the lands. The lands seem like they're just free spells. They actually just aren't that great. If you're playing a mono-colored deck, I would consider playing 1 or 2 copies of these cards. But if you're playing a 2-colored deck, they typically just are not coming to play when there's 3 copies of a Swamp or a Forest or whatever already out there. Their effects aren't super relevant. I would say Gingerbread Cabin has the largest effect. Just getting that food token can be relevant. And Mono Green is one of the decks you're more likely to play. I would say Mono Green and maybe Mono White, and I guess Mono Blue. So if you're in a mono-color deck, sure. If you're in a 2-color deck, these are just really hard to trigger and usually just end up being tap lands. So I would be very wary of putting them in my deck. Maybe 1 copy, especially if you have like Witch's Cottage and you have just a complete bomb. Like you can get your Feasting Troll King back from the graveyard to your hand, sure. But but then you're never going to do that because Feasting Troll King has 4 green in his mana cost, and so you're going to be way too green to ever get it back. But maybe like a Clackbridge Troll or something. Just want to talk about these lands real quick and kind of give a disclaimer about them. So that's all I have for this video. I know it was a long one. It's probably end up being about an hour long when it's all said and done. But I tried to go over every deck. I tried to talk about all of my favorite cards that I've played with. One of the coolest things about this format, and the reason I love it, is because I was going through the internet looking for pictures of 3-0 deck list, and there's 15 different decks in this format, and probably in the first 20 pictures I looked at were 13, 14 different decks and color pairs, which is just really great because it leaves you very open in the draft to finding what colors are open and which cards you should be picking. I highly recommend you use that list I gave from Quarter Calls and in determining which pick 1 pack 1 cards you should be taking, and then just keep your eyes open for those powerful cards we talked about: the Strong Removal in Black and Red, Ardent Veil Tactician, Fairy Godmother, Flutterfox, Outmost Soul, and Witch Carver, Witch Carver, the green card in green. And, I hope you guys just enjoy it a lot. I hope you learned something from this video. If there's any future updates to the format, I'll probably make one quick video just discuss anything else. I really just want to get all the best information out there and really give a full, complete breakdown of the format. So hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye.